Welcome to Rookie Me Central's AFL Draft Night 1 countdown. We'll of course be at Marvel tonight from 7pm to hear the first pick read, but there's plenty of content to come out before that. In tonight's video, what we're going to be discussing are all the key talking points ahead of the first round, and we'll also hear from a multitude of guests, starting with player agent Julian Petrarca. We'll hear from South Australian coach Tony Bamford and his Vic Country counterpart Paul Corrigan. We'll also hear from one of the big names in the list management and recruiting world, Sydney Swans' Kinnear Beatson. Let's get stuck into it. I'm your host, Peter Williams, Chief Editor of Rookie Me Central, and tonight I'm joined by a couple of special guests, of course, AFL Draft Editor Michael Alvaro, and all the way from South Australia, Draft Analyst Tom Wyman. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure as always. Yeah, I'll go first as the one I see here. Good to have you on, Tom, and always good to be here on draft day, our Christmas. So always exciting.
Absolutely. How are you, Tom?
Very well, thanks. Great to be over in Melbourne for the draft. It's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not too bad weather at the moment, but that'll probably change. So tonight we've got a huge edition, really. I guess Final Siren podcast coming to you live again. So let's get stuck into it. I mean, we kind of know from the top the way that it's going to go the first few picks, don't we? So we'll start with the first pick. GWS, Aaron Cadman, I think we can pretty much lock that in, can't we?
Yeah, well, Brisbane's, I guess, claiming ignorance to this, but I think most people reckon that GWS will pull the trigger at pick 1 for Aaron Cadman, of course, their own man. He gets the nice NAB grant and heads up to Sydney with a bit of cash in pocket, so that's nice. And then obviously North Melbourne seems to be the team that's going to go with that bid for Will Ashcroft.
Absolutely. I guess, Tom, what do you sort of make of the decision not to bid for Ashcroft on 1? If it was you, would you bid for him, or would you prefer to take the player at pick 1 that sort of you're bringing in?
Yeah, it's tricky because they've traded up for one reason, and it is for Cadman. But I think if you're speaking of you take the number 1 player on your draft board, I think it's Ashcroft. I would be bidding, but they've got their man and they want a key forward, so they can't complain with that.
Absolutely. So we know Cadman and Ashcroft, as we said, will go 1 and 2, or we presume so, unless there's a massive shock on the night. The next two also seem pretty locked in. North Melbourne, George Wardlaw and Harry Sheasel. It doesn't really matter what order they take them in, but I mean, for you, what are they going to add to North's list?
Plenty. So Wardlaw is sort of pegged as that Jason Horne-Francis replacement. Obviously, they just lost him. Through trade period. That was
12 months ago we were talking about him.
Yeah, I know. It's funny how things change. Harry Sheasel, obviously a bit of excitement up forward, reliable goal kicker. Just a bit of X factor they probably need, a bit of flair. Can probably play midfield as well in the future, but they're well stocked there, as we know. So Wardlaw comes in, he can probably play year 1, round 1, if his body holds up, and then Sheasel the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets a bit interesting when it comes to Essendon at pick 5. Obviously, we know they're sort of deciding between a couple of players. We've heard different sort of, rumours, if you like. Tom, I'll let you talk about one of them, obviously, one of the guys you've actually interviewed on your part of the Final Siren podcast, Mateus Philippou. Give us a bit of a rundown into what makes him such a good player.
Oh well, Mateus is a freakish player. He's everyone hears about how confident and assured he is in himself, and he plays a bit like that too. Really powerful player. He's got the great height, the really tall midfielder, can play at half forward next year, probably straight away, but projects as a big body midfielder into the future. And I mean, he's there's no one really knows where he's going yet, but wherever he lands, he's sure to make a big impact straight away, no doubt.
Absolutely. The other player in the conversation for that 5th spot, Elijah Sardis, obviously missed a fair bit of footy due to injury, but the footy he did play, he was phenomenal, really. He won the Oakley Best and Fairest. In that final game against Metro, he found plenty of the ball. He's really developed well, but what is it about him that I guess Essendon fans can look forward to if they pick him up?
Well, he's just a point of difference for one. So I think, and that's why he may even be the favourite to go with that pick if Essendon end up holding on to it, which may be a talking point as well. But he's got speed, so he's probably not the primary ball winner that they might want as that sort of bigger body in there. But once released, like, he's impossible to catch. Absolute jet. Gets to the outside. He's got good skills going forward inside 50. So he's just a damaging player that's different to what they've got already. And given there's so many midfielders in that range, either Filippo or Sardis would sort of suit their needs for sure.
Absolutely. And just on that talking point while you bring it up, obviously that is the first pick that's been discussed as a potential trade. Tom, I'll go to you first. Melbourne are offering up to 3 first-round picks for it. Now, we know that chances are they'll probably be later first-round picks, but what would you do in their situation if you're Essendon?
So tough because you don't know who's number one on their board. Like, what do they see at that point? But if I'm Essendon, I'm taking a player. Unless it's a deal you can't refuse from, say, Melbourne or whatever. But I'd be taking a player, and if it's Sardis or Philippou, that's up to Essendon's board and Dodoro and all that. But I'd be taking my guy at number 5, pick 5. Yeah.
And Michael, what would you do?
I just think it's such a good deal for Melbourne that I wouldn't take it from an Essendon standpoint, because it works out perfectly for him. And there's always risk in crystal ball into next year, because they're going to have Fremantle and Melbourne's first rounders in that situation. So we know that next year looks like a pretty good draft, but that's still a big risk to take a whole year out. So I probably wouldn't take it. I'd go with one of these two for sure.
Yeah, Fremantle's a bit of an unknown, I feel. Melbourne, you generally feel will be in at worst sort of that top 6 to 8 bracket at the very worst, but still, there's nothing in the guaranteed pointy end of the draft, which I think if we were talking a top 5 pick potentially next year, then they'd definitely have to take a look at it. But as it stands, I think that's the way that it's looking. I think they'll probably hold on to it. But anyway, our first guest, we had an interview during the week, was with player agent Julian Petrarca. He's got some of the heavy hitters in this year's draft, starting with Will Ashcroft and Aaron Cadman, but we hear from him now.
Has there been any competition internally between some of the boys, like with obviously where they're ranked, where they're tipped to go? Because you've got probably the number 1 and 2. So
yeah,
does Ashy sort of say to Aaron, you're cutting my lunch here? Or?
I'd probably say no. They've met through us and through a few of the events. I think both boys, they're both humble. Like they know that they're getting taken, which is a great thing. They've sort of said, like, I couldn't picture some of our mates that going through the draft and maybe not knowing of what's going to happen. And they said, both of them have said, like, whether it's 1 or 2, I think once you get to a club, they're just ready to get to work. They're both hard workers, and I think they're both ready to go to that next level. So I think the number for them will be a thing for maybe 24, 48 hours. But I reckon once they hit the training track, they'll realise that they're the small fish again, and they've got to build themselves up. So for us, that's part of our role as well, making sure that it's not a title. Be grateful that you get drafted, and then the hard work really starts.
That was player agent Julian Petrarca discussing some of his clients that he has on the books. Now we're going to run into the second half of the top 10. Obviously, we've discussed the top 5, but the next couple of picks are where it gets a little interesting. We know that Bailey Humphrey's going to come into consideration and is probably the favourite for Gold Coast. Ruben Ginby's another one that could go anywhere from 5th through to sort of that 9th bracket. I guess we'll discuss those two because, Michael, you did a player comparison on them, a head-to-head. So give us a bit of a rundown into the differences between those two.
Yeah, well, first off, both powerful midfielders, if you're looking at similarities. Really good, strong, contested ball winners. But the difference, I guess, is mainly that Bailey Humphrey rolls forward from midfield. Ruben Ginby can play back. So a little bit of a positional uniqueness between them. I think both, the reason why we compared them was because they are so similar. So both have a bit of polish to add with their kicking. They're really slick by hand though. Got that explosive step. So they're going to be, I guess, valuable players within that top 10. Great characters as well. And highly sought after, as you say. Gold Coast probably going with Humphrey, but Ginby is a similar player that they could look at as well.
There's a lot of inside midfielders in that part of the top 10, if you like, or so we project. Another one to take a look at is one of our favourites, obviously Jai Clark. He's someone that could go anywhere, really, from Hawthorn through to potentially St Kilda. a club's potentially looking to trade into that group because of the evenness there? Like, could one of those teams look to perhaps trade down if they think that there's 4 or 5 of these inside midfielders?
Yeah, I mean, the clubs in that range will all be battling for one of them. I think, if you don't get a Humphrey and you end up with Gimby, you're not going to be too upset. Given some of the similarities that they have. The differences lie where you look at maybe a Jai Clark, because he probably doesn't have the athletic points of differences of those two, even like a Filippo as well. And then Sardis, they're all just slightly different. But if you're looking for power in midfield, this is the draft. You want to be in that sort of that 5 to 12 bracket. And clubs like Carlton and St Kilda will really back themselves to get a good slider out of that lot. That's if they don't trade, particularly Carlton. So definitely there's value in that kind of archetype early on.
Absolutely. And Tom, obviously, Crows had that pick 5 originally. You got Isaac Rankin out of it. So how are you sort of feeling in regards to that trade and knowing that, I guess you could have had pick 5, but you've got a ready-made talent? How are your sort of thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, I think, especially in this day and age where the go-home factor is so prevalent, I think I'm pretty, personally, from a Crows perspective, happy with Rankin. I think any South Australian that wants to come home is a good get from the Crows. But it's obviously a little bit bittersweet because if you've got pick 5, you see all these great players that are heading elsewhere. It's a bit annoying. But if you get your guy, I think you can't be too unhappy with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another, I guess, inside midfielder, if you like, has sort of played alongside Will Ashcroft there, is Cam Mackenzie. Now, we know he's a St Kilda NGA, but the big question is, will he get there?
Could do. I think Hawthorn, for all their internal struggle and between a few stakeholders, they have interest at pick 7. So it's going to be an interesting decision depending on who sort of sneaks through. Obviously, Sardis and Philippou would be in consideration there, even Gimby. But seems like Cam Mackenzie is one that, some of the staff do like. So. If not Hawthorn, then St Kilda would be a pretty good match too, you'd think. Obviously, he's familiar with the region, with the training facilities. So why not? I mean, if he's not going to get there through the NGA bidding system, then just pick him up through the open draft.
Yeah, absolutely. And if he's there, I'd say they'll go for him. It really is a pivot point, if you like, with Essendon, because we know either Philippou or Sardis. If Sardis is available, the general consensus from what I have heard is that he'll then go to Hawthorn. But if they end up picking Sardis, that's Essendon, then they'll more likely go Mackenzie. Is that a fair sort of summation? Is that what you would do in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would probably take Sardis if I was Essendon. But if not, I think Hawthorn, you have to look at best available. Sardis is probably a top 5 prospect. That's not to say that, Cam Mackenzie isn't. But they're not similar players, but they're going to play a similar role at the next level. So I think you'd go for the better one, which is arguably Sardis.
Yeah, and the other player that I think is worth mentioning, just in case, he has been, invited to the draft, Jed Buslinger, key defender, probably a point of difference other than really Cadman sort of in that top group. Can you see him going top 10?
Geelong might be a fit. Obviously, Jai Clark's been the man that's connected to him, local boy. Ever since they got that pick, he's been massively linked. So that's an option for Geelong if he's there. But Jed Buslinger, I think, probably fits better. They might need that long-term key defensive depth and could free up De Koning to potentially play in the ruck long-term. So, yeah, it'd be interesting. Even West Coast will probably be interested in their local boy as well. Not that they... too biased towards them, but yeah.
Absolutely. Speaking of Jai Clark, now obviously he's coach at the Geelong Falcons, Paul Corrigan, and Vic Country coach, so he's doubled up with him a few times, and a number of players in this group, such as Cadman and Humphrey, of course, as well at Vic Country. We spoke to Paul Corrigan last week, and here's an interview with him now.
And obviously running into the draft, we'll touch on a few of the players that you've coached across both teams. And it's probably only natural that we start with Jai Clark, obviously the captain for both teams as well, and MVP, probably best and fairest for the Falcons, I would assume. So I mean, tell me a little bit about him. What's so good about him? Because obviously he's touted as a top 10 prospect, and yeah, he's one of the best going around at the moment.
Yeah, he's a terrific kid. I've had the privilege to be able to work with him for the last 2 years, which has been really, really good. He's a level-headed kid, loves his footy, and is just so professional even at this age already. I saw him come through in his 17s year last year and just saw the attributes of the type of player that he was. Very good inside, contested ball, but he had this unique ability on the outside too to be able to take a mark in the air, be able to go forward, hit the scoreboard where he could. And I think his ability just to impact games with his two-way running is probably his biggest strength. Probably haven't seen too many like him that run both ways with their transition, and his willingness to get back and help his defence and then push forward in offence is real attribute to, I guess, where he's taken his game, over the last 2 years, and probably why he puts himself, high up in that draft end, coming in a couple of weeks.
That was Geelong Falcons and Vic Country coach Paul Corrigan. Now we're going to move into the next segment, which is talking about some of the bids that might come in the first round. Now, we know there's a few players that are in discussions across really the nation, multiple states. We'll start with the bid we think, obviously, other than Ashcroft, that'll come in first, which is Jasper Fletcher out of Brisbane. Michael, is that fair to say he's sort of assumed that top position now as the second bid?
Yeah, I mean, clubs in that sort of teen range will be pretty interested in Jasper Fletcher, really classy hybrid midfielder in the sense that he can play inside or out, probably more outside leaning at this point. But yeah, he gets to Brisbane. A club like the Western Bulldogs might look at bidding just as a sort of how you go into Brisbane for Nab and Josh Dunkley. But yeah, any of those clubs from 12 to 15, you'd say, maybe even later, going to pull the trigger, you'd reckon?
Yep. He's one of the ones that obviously fits that midfielder build as well. We've got quite a few midfielders, as is always the case in this sort of bracket. The other player, I guess, for the Crows, Max McElhenney, give us a bit of rundown into him and why he's in first round discussions.
Yeah, so Max is sort of a general defender, you'd say, but he's got a bit of height to him, and that allows him to play on tall and small opponents, and he's got a lot of defensive versatility in that he can play a number of different roles. He's very task-orientated player, very, very team first. If he's given a role, he'll do it. And then we're just sort of seeing a bit of run come into his game, a bit of run and carry off half-back, which is really good. And so the Crows will be pretty happy with picking up him as a father-son, definitely.
Yeah, and one of the big players in this year's draft in terms of bids, both from a father-son and next-generation academy, is Essendon. I think I'll just sort of let you cover it, Michael, because you can kind of cover three players in one. The Davey twins, Anthony Munkara, where do you sort of see all of them sort of ending up?
Yeah, well, luckily for Essendon, you'd think that Owen Davey Jr. gets bid on after their pick 22. So, yeah, obviously that's handy. You get to bring in another player on top of the one who you're already going to get. So that'll come probably somewhere in the second round, about 23 to 30, you'd think. Could even slide outside that top 30 range. Same goes with Harry Rouston for GWS. Of course, an academy member there. But back to the Davey boys, Jaden will likely be taken with Essendon's last pick in the national draft. That's probably the deal that they've got going on there. To some, he's just as good as Owen, so it's going to be great that they get him on the cheap, coming off that ACL injury. And Anthony Munkara looks even more likely now to be a Category B rookie for Essendon, which is a great result given how talented he is. So I think he slides definitely outside the top 40. If he gets a bid, then oh well. If not, yeah, Category B.
Absolutely. His upside is incredible, and Bombers fans will be very excited to get him on the books if that eventuates. This will sort of lead into our next topic. Could a team potentially leverage off a bid for Davey or Rouston and say, hey, we're about to bid on this player, we want this off you, otherwise, yeah, we're going to bid on him, potentially, particularly for an Essendon or in that case GWS, but Essendon, where they sort of sit in that range where Davey is kind of in the area. Is that something that could potentially happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's dangerous for GWS because they got Rouston as well to think about. So if they're threatening bids to other clubs. It's a bit of throwing stones. But clubs like Melbourne and Sydney have tabled their first round picks. Obviously, GWS is another one there. So it'd be interesting to see who sort of gets on the phone early and what selections trigger that. But it's definitely something you can leverage. I know like a club like Collingwood's probably one that's going to be keen to bid on a few players like Michael Annie, like in that range, because they're probably interested in a guy like Jacob Ryan who can play a similar role. So, I think they might be the villain.
Yeah, absolutely. And after Dacos last year, they don't have anything that they can be threatened with themselves. So quite right for this year. Speaking of trading, a few clubs have expressed interest in trading into the top 10. As we mentioned just before on the other segment, Essendon's pick's probably the first one that clubs are realistically thinking could be gettable. But also I think that it's often more likely that clubs may trade up 3 or 4 selections just to get a player that may go in that time. So could someone potentially like a Collingwood or a GWS or someone along those lines look to trade up from, say, that 16, 17 kind of range up to, say, 11 to 13 just to potentially grab a player that's a little bit of an upgrade on what they might have?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it with, guys like Campbell Chester and Josh Sinn, clubs moving up and down in last year's first round. So it could be the case. I actually think clubs like Carlton, even Sydney, will trade back in the order. So Carlton, like they did with Brody Kemp and Sam Philp in the first round a few years back, split that sort of pick 10 and then take 2 players a bit down the order, because it is quite an even range. Sydney as well, interested in people like Harry Barnett, for example, who he's probably going to be on the board still in the 20s. So they've got 2 first round picks within that range. So if you trade back, then you probably get better value. So I think that might be a go. Melbourne's the one that could trade into the top 10. I think they have been quite aggressive, obviously linked with Essendon's pick 4 and have tabled an offer there, it seems. So I think that they're the sort of scenarios we're looking at,
Yeah, and what we've seen in the past, and I think Sydney was the one to have done this during their academy days, is where they'd matched a bid or they'd traded out, then traded back in once they'd matched the bid. Could we see that with some of these first round prospects? Can you see something like that happening, Tom? Or do you think most
absolutely. No, I think that can definitely happen. It's always a possibility, and live trading brings so much more, adds a different dynamic to it. So absolutely, that's definitely on the cards.
And just the final question there, which players do you reckon could be worth jumping up the order for, potentially from that mid to late first round to the, say, 11 to 14 bracket?
Well, it depends what clubs see on their board. Like a club might really, and it also depends, I guess, on intel from other clubs, what they sort of like and what they know other clubs are looking for. I think Collingwood's interested in Jacob Ryan. So what if another club wants to jump in ahead of them before they have their first couple of picks and grab him? Obviously, South Australian halfback, he could be one that a club looks to get up the board for and jump in, but there's plenty of them. Absolutely.
One of the clubs that's been discussed about moving up and down the board is the Sydney Swans. Now we're going to hear from their General Manager of Recruiting and List Strategy, Kinnear Beatson, who's one of the big players every year, and no doubt he's got a few things up his sleeve. So here's Kinnear Beatson chatting to us last week.
In terms of Sydney's list, obviously coming off a trade period, which saw you bring in Aaron Francis. You've got picks 14 and 17 sort of at the front end of the draft haul. So are you pleased of where you sit coming into draft night?
Yes, and on a number of fronts. I mean, the first thing that we wanted to do was avoid having to trade players out. And it was pleasing that not one player on our current list requested a trade. So that was great. And I think this year was just a bit different to the years gone by because COVID wasn't as, didn't have the same impact on the players and not being able to see their families. And then pick 14, well, that's Melbourne's future first. We didn't expect that it would come in quite as low as that, so that's been an added bonus. Now, what we do with those 2 picks, we're really open-minded about that. We've worked hard this morning on trying to get our list order together from sort of 1 to 20. We're pretty much there now. But for us, we've got sort of almost 2 three sections of that first round. One that you'd like to trade up for, if you could get into that group of small players, we would. But then otherwise, would we hold 14 or trade it out? Would we hold 17, trade it out? Depends what's on offer and depends on who's going to be there.
That was Sydney Swans General Manager of Recruiting and List Management, Kinnear Beatson, chatting about some of the moves he could potentially make and his club as a whole. We're going to move into another discussion now. Draft bolters and sliders, they happen every year. There's plenty we can talk about on this topic. I'll start with you this time, Tom. A few bolters that you've found just in general throughout the year that perhaps at the start of the year they may not have been rated as highly, but by year's end, who have you sort of identified as some bolters?
Yeah, well, I'll start with a couple of South Australians, naturally. And I'll go with Jaden Magor as one from South Adelaide. He's sort of a hybrid sort of mid-forward who's played some really awesome football at times, particularly during the sort of last couple of games where I think he kicked about 11 goals in 2 games in the sample for the Panthers. But he can go inside and win his own ball in the midfield and then push forward and be really dangerous, sort of one out as a deep forward. So he's one that I'll, don't be surprised if he sort of gets some attention in the 20s maybe. And another one is a different player altogether in Phoenix Foster from Norwood. He's a ruck tall forward who we saw in a championships game with Harry Barnett out, and he really tore it up, I guess, at Thebarton Oval, and I think that was the game that really got him attention, got recruiters' heads turning, and so maybe he's probably a late pick, but he's one that has come from nowhere sort of to being draftable.
Absolutely. Michael, I guess outside South Australia, who are some of the bolters you've found?
Still outside South Australia, over to Western Australia. I think some of the more obvious ones, particularly up the order, guys like Ed Allen, sort of come from nowhere to, having recovered from those stress fractures in his back, play a handful of waffle games, tear up the draft combine, and he's a first-round prospect. So he's one. Ruben Gimby as well, MVP for his state, came from the clouds to debut in the Waffle League for his Perth round 1. Bailey Humphrey's another one who, when he came back from injury for Gippsland, was incredible. So they've all bolted into sort of that top 10 range, if not first round. And one more who I really like is Harvey Gallagher, not of course in that range, but 19-year-old, changed position late in the year and just sort of skyrocketed, I guess. He came back into draft contention. He's missed last year's draft, the mid-season draft, but I rate him highly. I think he'll get picked up now.
First player selected from the state combine list, do you think?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think, because him, maybe even Joe Richards could be a shout as another or even more mature ager. One of those two I think would be right up there off the top of my head.
Yep, fair enough. And Tom, I'm sure you'll have extensive knowledge on this. The sliders. Who's
what do you say? That's a bit rough on the South Aussies.
Oh, there's a few South Australians, obviously, that are, probably around the latter stage of the draft. Kobe Ryan's a name that probably some will know. Earlier in the year, he was sort of touted as a, sort of end of first round, second round prospect. He's probably not quite that anymore. But it's not for any fault of his own. He's played some great footy this year. It's just he's sort of a, that sort of mid, that sort of, clubs already have a few of them on their list. But, he's a great character. Tries his absolute heart out on the field. Tough, despite being a little bit, slight at this stage. Actually quite athletic, especially for a midfielder. So he's one that might be available quite late for a club that's looking for a bit of midfield depth. And then obviously there's some tall prospects in South Australia as well. South Adelaide ruckman Will Verrill is probably going to be available late. And there's Adam Deloyer as well as a midfielder who's another one who's sort of similar to Kobe Ryan, where he was sort of touted as a potential, earlier pick early in the year, but not sort of the case anymore. But he's definitely a good value pick, sort of later in the draft. Yeah,
he's probably one of the more bizarre sliders, if you like, because you don't normally have a slider who wins their state MVP.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. Hopefully it does get picked up somewhere because, you've got consistency and character obviously within that. And I know there's a couple more that I'll touch on at the end that Tony Bamford speaks about. But Michael, I guess, again, outside South Australia, who do you sort of see as perhaps some of the sliders, but they could well be value later in the...
Yeah. Big one's going to be Elijah Hewitt. Could have been a top 10 prospect coming into the year. Probably the best out of Western Australia as well, coming into his top age campaign. And although he's played senior football consistently, sort of seems destined to maybe even slip into the second round. So I think his football alone suggests that he's going to be great value in that range because he's a gun. I mean, we know what he can do. Super explosive type in midfield. Probably suits some of the ones, play similarly to guys that are going in the top 10. Another slider could be Mitch Sibkowski and even Henry Huswaite from Dandenong. I think there are a couple who, as Tom sort of alluded to, were touted early on, early in the year and just probably have a few traits that maybe recruiters don't necessarily look for, or the downside to them is what is bringing them down. So I think they could be second round chances, I'd say.
Absolutely. So obviously during the week we spoke to South Australian coach Tony Bamford. He discussed plenty of his players, including some of the ones that Tom mentioned, as well as some of the tools, Harry Lemmy and Tom Scully. And I guess their years and things like that, looking into the draft. So here's Tony Bamford discussing some of the South Australian prospects.
Both of those boys would agree that they didn't have their best years in terms of consistency. As you said, Tom started really well. Playing as a deep tall forward at Westies in the under-18s. But unfortunately for Tom, when we asked him to take his game to a higher level in some trial games with the under-18 state team against New South Wales in under-20s, and also in an internal trial that we had way back in May, he just wasn't able to transfer the form that he showed for Westies under-18s to state level, which can happen. He's not the first player for that to occur. But what I really did like about Tom during our program was he never stopped working. He never stopped looking for ways to improve. He always remained upbeat around the program and working on his deficiencies, and he did that at West Adelaide. And so that was a good sign from us to see a player who knew wasn't going as well as he should, to dig deep and start to do some more work on his own. Harry Lemmy is probably a little bit of a different story because this time last year, Harry had already played a number of league games for West Adelaide as a 17-year-old. And he also played in some state games for SA last year as a 17-year-old as well. Harry missed the start he was interrupted over pre-season and the start of the season with some COVID issues, going into isolation once because family members had COVID, and then coming out of that and then missing the trip to Melbourne with the National Academy because he had COVID, tested positive to COVID the morning before we left. So he didn't have much luck, the big fella, in the first part of our year, and was playing league football at Westies and not getting a lot of the football, and probably was lacking a little bit in his confidence and in his ability to play at that high level. And unfortunately for Harry, when he came into the state program, he wasn't able to refine the form or the confidence that he showed last year as a 17-year-old. But I think he's done enough over certainly as a 16 and 17-year-old, his form was as high-end talent for a tall who's really mobile and can run. So I think he'll find his way in an AFL list, but it was just a disappointing under-18 year for him.
That was South Australian coach Tony Bamford discussing some of his AFL draft chances in tonight's draft. Now we're going to move on to our final topics for the evening, starting off with the go-home factor. Now, Tom, it's a pretty big talking point. Obviously, we've seen, as recently as the last trade period with Jason Horne-Francis heading home and plenty of other examples as we've seen, not just first year, but second and beyond. It's not a new thing, but how big is the go-home factor for, say, a non-Victorian club?
Yeah, well, it's obviously massive. It's just the reality of the footy landscape these days. That's a big factor in every decision, especially come draft night. I'm not sure it is the only factor. I'm not sure. Different clubs will view it and sort of have a higher weighting on it. But yeah, it definitely comes into consideration, particularly if you've got two players that you really like and rate quite evenly. Then if one's South Australian from, say, the Crows or Port, and one's Victorian, you generally, I think, gonna favour your home state. So, but yeah, it does come into consideration for sure.
Yeah, Michael, your thoughts on the go home factor?
Yeah, I think it's going to even be a big factor in this year's draft. And, you look right at the top, Aaron Cadman's one who, GWS traded up for to get at pick one. They're going to take guys you'd think like Charlie Clark, Jacob Constanti, Braden George, who, at least the latter two are country boys and sort of don't have that go home factor, or at least have probably fielded that. So yeah, it's definitely going to play a role in the first round of the draft and has done increasingly. So, like whether those clubs take risks on interstate kids, like even Tasmanians. Like, do you pick Tasmanians high up the order, given that they might get a team, in the next few years?
Yeah.
Like, it's a bit of a risk because they'd love, I'm sure, to go back home and play footy in their state's inaugural team. So, yeah, it's going to be a funny one for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a bit difficult when they don't have a year. They're going to have a Tassie team, though, because that could be 5 years, 6 years down the track. So,
but then, like, they'd be in their prime pretty much. Like, they'd be, 23, 24 years old if they get a team in 5 years' time and they're ready to go. They'd be almost a marquee for that team. So, yeah.
Yeah. It'll be an interesting discussion when they do come in, but, we'll see what happens with that. The other key is... Talls versus Smalls. Obviously, we've seen it in the past. There's been some terrific decisions on key position players up the top end. Probably more so later, like more recently. But then there's also been some that, have ended up being flops, basically. Just purely for whatever reason, be it the rules at junior level or they just didn't quite develop the way the club might have liked. What's the kind of risk there for the, say, picking a tall over a small or a medium tall?
Yeah, I think right at the top end, maybe bar Josh Shackey in recent years, like you don't get too many misses. So I think Cadman's a relatively safe one. You look at the King twins, Jacob Wiedering, even Mackay and Kerno, all in one draft, those three for Carlton. So it can be done. You can hit with those talls right up the top, but I think some clubs, even you look at Melbourne, they might be looking further down the order for a tall, like not necessarily a Jefferson that they've been linked to in that first round. So this draft was touted as one that was going to be full of talls. Hasn't panned out that way, as Kinnear Beatson so kindly told us as well. Obviously when we chatted to him, so. Yeah, I don't think there'll be that many at the top end. Probably just Cadman, maybe Bustlinger, Weddle will be one, and Hayes probably early second round.
Yeah. Tom, I know the Crows have taken some talls in recent years. Obviously, you've got Tilthorpe, you've had Fogarty as well. Like, there's a few there that are larger, I guess, than your regular mids all the time. But how have you sort of found it for an overall AFL landscape?
Yeah, so I think Adelaide took Fisher Mackesy a couple of years back, hoping he'd be the next centre half bat for the next 10 years, and I'm not sure it's panned out that way, unfortunately. But there's still some need there, I think, from a Crows perspective for a key position defender. I think the forwards look relatively set, but with Frampton out the door, I think there's room there for a key back. Other clubs that might be looking to go key position, I think, are Fremantle, maybe late, target some homegrown. Maybe talent there from WA. Collingwood, I think, is another, might need some key position, and probably Port Adelaide as well. They've been exposed a bit in the key defence for lacking that really tall defender to take on the Tilthorpes and the Kings that are, and the Mackays, the big, huge key forwards. So I think there's a need there for Port. Not sure that there's probably a player like that in the draft. There might be, but maybe not in their range. So, but yeah, there's obviously a need there, I think, for key position players. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be an interesting overall discussion for clubs on draft night, no doubt, which is not too far away, as we said. First pick is at 7 p.m. tonight, and all the interviews we've had in today's, show are going to be up on our YouTube channel, so make sure you check all of them out. We're going to have some live Q&A throughout both nights, so make sure you're following us on our socials at Rookie Me Central. That's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're going to have lots of content up over the next couple of days. Obviously, website content. We're going to have all the draft profiles. As they drop, we'll be tweeting them out, and then you'll be able to see their full profiles. Make sure you download the AFL Draft Guide. It's still free and on our site, along with our Phantom Draft. We've also got the updated Phantom Draft 2, which goes all the way to the second round, which Michael's so kindly done. So you'll be able to compare how it all happens, and we'll have some late news along with this tonight. Other than that, gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Michael, thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Tom, thanks for coming along.
Awesome. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So we'll be back again tomorrow with the wrap-up of Night 1 and looking forward to Night 2. That's all from me, your host, Peter Williams. You've been listening to the Final Siren podcast. Thanks very much for joining us.